All right, guys, final video on World War One, the aftermath and the end of the war. So just to make sure you get a full picture of the war, we're going to look at exactly what happened, what the consequences were, and finally, again, who won and how and why. So long story short, Germany lost, in part because in 1918 they have to launch this last desperate offensive with the last of their troop reserves, and they don't quite manage to roll up either the British army or take Paris or defeat the French. They attack a couple different things, they advance, but they never make it all the way. Their offensive always grinds to a halt. They do that because at the beginning of 1918, they have superior troops on the Western Front. Russia has been knocked out of the war, and so all the troops from the Eastern Front have come over, and things look good. But they don't have hardly any tanks. They have about 15 to the Allies' 800, and they don't have enough troops to actually break either of these armies, at least the way they go about it. And one of the major problems there is, and the reason that they're kind of forced to spend their troops on attack instead of just defending and saying, "Come at me, bro. All right, let's sign a treaty. We'll keep what we took," is because America has entered the war. And you're going to be doing some research on that, or you've already done it. But America enters the war against Germany for a number of reasons, and when they do, the balance of power shifts completely in favor of the Allies. So this war has been a war of attrition. Everybody is fighting to run the enemy out of troops. In 1917, the French army mutinied. The French general said, "We're going to attack," and the French army said, "Yeah, no, if the Germans come here, I'll shoot them, but I'm not going there. I'm not going to their trench. Enough of us have died." And historians think that largely is because by 1918, really, the French army had lost more than 100% casualties of its total strength. And what I mean by that is more men had died than had been in the French army, or than were in it, in all of its divisions if they were at full strength. They'd resupplied those men with reserves. But because of that, troops had decided, if we've taken 100% casualties, I'm just going to die if I attack. They had no confidence that victory was going to be achieved. The British were around there as well. The Germans were around there. The Russians certainly got to that point. Most of the armies were at that point or getting to that point. Similar things are going to happen as the war ends. The German army will largely mutiny against orders and begin joining the Sue for Peace. The Kaiser kind of goes back and is all like, "No, we can do it. We can crush them." And the army's like, "We're done." So the will to fight is being lost. Men, again, there's a certain calculus and a certain percentage of deaths. They're just not willing to try anymore. And so that had really, the British, the French, the Germans, the Austrians, the Italians, pretty much everybody who'd been fighting reached that level. The Russians had reached that level earlier, and they were out. And then America joins the war. America joins the Allies and says, "Hey, we've got fresh troops." And every month, 200, 300,000 fresh American troops are coming across the Atlantic Ocean and joining the Allied trenches. And these troops, unlike all the British and French troops, are more than ready to attack and are more than ready to die because they still believe victory can be achieved. So the Allies get reinforced. As the Germans are invading, there's this great story where a group of American Marines, because those were the only American troops that were actually trained before the war, and there weren't actually very many of those, were there, and the French army is retreating, and they're like, "Run away, get back, what are you guys doing?" And the Marines are like, "Retreat? Hell, we just got here!" And they charge in and stop the German advance, which is this hoorah America moment, but there aren't a lot of those because we're only in the end of the war. But that gives an idea of the difference in mentality between the American troops and the other troops that are running away. America is going to raise millions of men, something like 2, 3, 4 million men, and the specter of millions of American troops showing up on the Western Front completely changes the balance of power. Germany realizes our only hope is if we win now. If we don't, next month, hundreds of thousands, we can't keep killing them. We don't have enough men. We will lose all our men. We can't win if a million American troops join the front. So they're kind of forced to go on the offensive, and their offensive fails. As a result, then the Americans leading the way and being willing to take casualties, along with the remaining French and British troops, will start pushing back the German lines until they sign an armistice, which is a peace agreement. It's not actually the end of the war. It's an end of hostility. We're going to stop shooting each other. And then they go to the peace conference, where Woodrow Wilson has been trying to broker a peace for a long time under his 14 points, which again you are or have studied. And let's look at the peace. So the Treaty of Versailles is signed. But this is a one-sided, uneven treaty. It is a treaty in which Germany is blamed for the war, and in which it's meant to ensure that Germany will never be able to invade France again. No, that doesn't work at all. World War II. Anyway, because it causes World War II, and Germany invades France again. So let's look at the points of this treaty. Number 1 was the surrender of all German colonies as League of Nations mandates. Number 2 was the return of Alsace-Lorraine to France, that key border region they'd been fighting over that had been taken in the Franco-Prussian War. We will skip the next 6 because they're all just other things that are taken away from Germany, basically. Number 8 is the demilitarization of a 15-year occupation of the Rhineland, this region next to Alsace-Lorraine, the German-French border. The Germans are not allowed to have any troops in the border region, and France is going to occupy German territory for 15 years to make sure Germany can never invade France again. Number 9, Germans pay reparations of a lot of pounds. I'll get back to what that would be in today's money. That'd be 6,600,000,000 pounds. An acceptance of Germany's guilt in causing the war. It was not Germany's fault. They didn't start it. Austria-Hungary attacked Serbia. Russia declared war on Austria-Hungary. Germany is like the 4th person to enter this war, but the treaty says it was Germany's fault. They were forced to accept that in the treaty, even though it wasn't true. Provision for the trial of the former Kaiser and other war leaders, Germany's war leaders, being put up for trial. A limitation of Germany's army to 100,000 men with no conscription, no tanks, no heavy artillery, no poison gas supplies, no aircraft, no airships. And the limitation of the German Navy to vessels under 100,000 tons. This is just handicapping Germany. It is just making sure that Germany is not allowed to have a real army. You can have 100,000 police. That's what you can have. No tanks, no planes, no battleships. And the point is to weaken Germany, to ensure Germany would never be able to invade France again. No conscription. You can't have trained reserves. It's humiliating. It is the revenge that France has wanted ever since the Franco-Prussian War, and they stick it all into this treaty and override the British and the Americans, who are just tired of war and want a peace, and just let France do it. And it's a disaster, and we're going to get back to that later, because this treaty directly causes World War II. World War II is a direct result of World War I. There are no 5 causes. The Treaty of Versailles and the end of the war is the cause, because that is what enables Hitler to rise. That is what enables all these things to happen. And part of that is there is a crippling debt placed on Germany because Germany is blamed for the war, and Germany is required to pay for the war. Instead of being like, hey, let's all pay evenly, we all fought and killed each other, it's like, Germany, it's all your fault, and you need to pay for it. That amounted to about $768 billion in today's money, a massive amount of money for any economy. Certainly for a crippled, ruined economy at the end of a war 100 years ago. As a result of that, World War I officially ended in 2010. Wait, you mean 1918, Mr. John? 1919? Peace conference? 2010, because that is when Germany finished paying off the war reparations. The armistice was signed in 1918, the peace treaty in 1919. The war officially ended when the Germans finished paying off their debts in 2010, which is about 70 years after the Second World War, not even to mention the first one, because it gets restructured and Hitler reneges on it, and then after the war, they're like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't make them pay all that. But Germany was paying off this war for almost 100 years, and Germany is the largest and most prosperous economy in Europe today. And it still took them until 2010. That is a not fair treaty, if I've ever heard of a not fair treaty. Again, there should be no question to your mind how this caused the Germans to want revenge, and therefore to start World War II. So, moving on. Let's look at what happened to some of these countries then. Let's look at Germany. Again, Germany is blamed. It ends largely, and they signed this treaty largely because they're being starved by an Allied blockade. And even after the armistice, the Allies don't stop the blockade. They have no way of getting food. They don't have colonies to send them food like Britain did. They don't have America to send them food. So the German people, as well as the army, are starving. And they don't have an army because they've demilitarized, and the Allies thrust this upon them like, sign. And Germany's like, hey, we didn't actually, you never invaded Germany. This isn't fair. We signed an armistice. And they're like, well, do you want us to keep invading and blockading you to starve to death? And the Germans have no choice. They're really betrayed in the peace conference. And that betrayal is something that Hitler is going to play upon massively as he seeks his rise to power. On top of all this, in the end, the Spanish flu will strike, a massive pandemic that's going to kill more people than World War I actually did, and which leads to about 500,000 German soldiers getting sick at the end of the war and being unable to fight. That also ensures that the Germans are going to go down. It hits them first before it then spreads through the American and other armies and into the populations of other countries. Basically, Germany gives up everything they gained and more. The Kaiser will abdicate and will be gone. He actually goes into exile in, I think, the Netherlands and is there still in exile by World War II. Hitler sends an honor guard to guard his palace after he takes over the Netherlands. So the Kaiser lives in exile because, again, he's related to all these other royal families. And it's like, oh, no, you can't rule Germany anymore, but here, have a nice castle and some delicious food for the rest of your life. Europeans. Anyway, 1.8 million German soldiers are killed, 4.2 million are wounded, 65% of the total mobilized troops of the German army in the entire war are wounded, killed, or captured. That means only 35% are still there, healthy. And that's total, right? Not the amount at the end, that's of the amount over all 4 years. And this leads directly to Hitler and the Nazis taking over because Hitler fought in this war, and he uses that to his advantage, even though he was a corporal and very insignificant. And he plays on these myths, and he plays on the revenge, and he uses that to take power, and he tears up the Treaty of Versailles, and that is his platform of politics. The French give a murdering madman a platform of politics, and Germany goes from being this great Christian Lutheran empire to becoming one led by an absolutely murderous secular regime. And let's go to Austria-Hungary. It's got to be better, right? Not right. The Italians invade Austria-Hungary even as they're suing for peace. Even after they sue for peace, the Italians keep invading because the Italians, in addition to being traitors, are jerks. In this war, not always. They make great pasta, delicious food. Anyway, Austria becomes Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland, 5 different countries. They lose 1.2 million dead and 3.6 million wounded, but that equates to 90% of their total mobilized troops are either killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. So only 10% of the people who ever joined the Austrian army weren't killed, wounded, or taken prisoner in this war. That is why the empire collapses. It's absolutely awful and completely uncontainable. So we have, alas, a memorial to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It does not survive the war. And here's a map again of where it is. You can see the Czech Republic, Austria, Slovakia, Hungary, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Croatia, Slovenia. Today, it's even more countries because some of those countries like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia don't exist anymore. So it really was this amalgam of countries that shouldn't have been one country, of a bunch of different people groups, and they break up and nationalism rises. And Wilson, in his 14 points, has this promotion of people choosing what country they're going to be in and they want to live in. And Austria is one where they're all like, okay, and they blow Austria-Hungary up in a bunch of different pieces. The empire no longer exists, this empire which has ruled for hundreds of years. And now a bunch of little nationalist states rise up from the ashes. Let's go to Mother Russia, because Mother Russia is in perhaps almost even worse situation. Russia's in a civil war. I kind of mentioned that a bit with the Red Terror in our last unit, so it ends in a civil war between the Reds and the Whites. More Russians will die in the civil war than died in World War I. The Soviets are saved by German disinterest because the German army was just outside St. Petersburg and could have pushed on, but the Germans wanted to get those troops to the Western Front. So they misjudged the threat of the Bolshevik regime. They're more concerned with the war at hand now. They allow it to survive because it signs a peace with them. They've taken all this land from them. Because of that, the Russians will be able to get there. A little bit later, the Tsar is killed, and Kaiser Wilhelm might be going, ooh, I could have saved my cousin, but I didn't. Probably felt bad about that one, but not much he could do by that point. And a lot of people misjudged really what was going to happen with the Bolsheviks and misunderstood and didn't calculate how bad that would be, especially when you get to World War II when Germany invades Russia again and then gets beaten largely by the Soviets. So, maybe that was a really poor choice on their part. But, as I said, the Tsar is killed. In Russia, 1.7 million troops are killed, 5 million are wounded, and 75% of the total mobilized troops are killed, wounded, or captured. So not quite as bad as Austria, but still only 25% of the people who ever signed up for the Russian army in the 4 years of this war weren't killed, wounded, or captured. That is a tiny percentage. It should not be surprising that they wound up pulling out of the war. And that Austria-Hungary collapses, and that the Russian Empire collapses, because in all those 1.7 million killed are all of the most loyal troops of the Russian Empire, and that leaves no one to put down rebellion as people start fighting over them. So what is the end result? The Soviet Union, communism. We'll get into that in more detail later, but let's just say it results in millions of people dying from starvation and a terrible murderous regime rising in Russia, which again used to be this bastion of Orthodox Christian empire. There's a trend going on here I'm going to harp on at the end. And that is this. Europe is devastated. Europe didn't need to be devastated. Europe in 1910, 1914 really was at the height of its power. It was a force largely for good in the world. The colonial era had happened and they'd done damage, but they were starting to come to this realization that they needed to help and actually improve the places that they ruled. The Dutch around this time are going to institute the ethical policy and others. And so there's more of a feeling of we need to help others and we need to bring peace. And we're in massive prosperity. And then all of a sudden they're just like, let's kill each other. It didn't need to happen. It devastates Europe. It destroys what could have been a century of peace and progress and growth for the whole world if Europe had shared with the rest instead of calling them all in to come die with them in the trenches. It destroys two powerful Christian empires, Germany and Russia, both of which, again, the Russian Tsar had been kind of the head of the Orthodox Church, the Kaiser was the head of the Lutheran Church. These were deeply religious people who believed in their faith and in general valued life and things like that. And replaced them with two murderous secular regimes, the Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, two of the most murderous regimes the world has ever seen, who among them account for millions and millions and millions dead, not even in the wars that they started, but just of their own people and those that they murdered through pogroms and other programs. And so it radically changes Europe in that way, and it really sets the stage for World War II, which winds up being a death match between those two murderous regimes, amongst other things. 8.5 million people will die. Soldiers will die over the course of the war. And the question everyone needs to be asking, again, is why didn't they stop? I had that great quote at the beginning of the Eastern Front where the guy said, all the guys should have just met at the wake of the Archduke, had a glass of vodka, toasted him, and gone home. Or after 1914, when it became clear that nobody was going to achieve a swift victory and this was just going to be a war of attrition, rather than starting the Battle of Verdun and be like, we must bleed the French army to death, maybe the Germans should have been like, okay, maybe let's see what we can get out of this. Let's sign a peace. Let's all go back home. We'll gain some territorial acquisitions because we've got this in these places, and then we're good. Or maybe in 1916, after Verdun and the Somme, when so many people had died, everybody should have been like, okay, let's just go back to our borders. We're done. But no, they kept going, and millions more people died. Why didn't anyone stop? Okay, again, just like the war wasn't inevitable, it wasn't inevitable that the war would go on until so many countries absolutely collapsed because of attrition. The Russian Empire into civil war, Austria-Hungary into not even being an empire, Germany into desperation to where they signed the Treaty of Versailles. There were so many points along the way that they could have stopped, that they should have stopped. Even if a war broke out, it didn't have to be a world war. It didn't have to utterly devastate these countries. People could have sued for peace and found some sort of solution to return the world to a status of peace. They could have realized that they just didn't know how to stop the stalemate and end it, and therefore just decide to leave it. But they didn't. They kept going. They kept murdering. They kept destroying. And as a result, again, they're going to devastate Europe. They're going to create long-standing animosity because of this, because the Treaty of Versailles is uneven and it leads to injustice. All the World War I really does is sets up the playing field for World War II. It introduces the major competitors, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia, these murderous secular regimes that are hell-bent on the destruction of each other. A German regime that's major focus is on the murder of ethnic groups that they find inferior, or a Soviet regime that has starved millions of their own people and will continue to do so, and is seeking world domination and to lead about a revolution of all the workers into this sort of thing. And that is, that cared nothing about human life. Britain, the great empire, does come out of World War I probably better than anybody else, but even they are devastated in terms of manpower and have to rebuild that stuff and aren't ready. The United States becomes a major player. They don't play the role they're going to play in World War II, but they're a major player. Japan, at the end of the war, jumps on Germany's colonies and takes a bunch of them over and is aggressively expanding its empire, which again, combined with the difficulties of not being given a fair seat at the Treaty of Versailles, leads to this animosity between them and the United States, because the United States has overseen the Treaty of Versailles, and they're not really listening to the Japanese and bringing them to the table. That's going to bring us to World War II. All this war really does is sets up World War II. So they call it the war to end all wars, but the irony is, I don't know if there's any war in human history, maybe the Franco-Prussian War because it kind of set up this war in a way, but that so directly led to another war. Really, that so directly caused an even greater calamity, World War II, which is why now we don't call this the war to end all wars, or even the Great War, but just World War I. All right, have a great day. Think for yourself why maybe you think they didn't stop. And if you have any questions, go ahead and bring them to our Zoom. See you guys.